After the floods, the result was a muddy, denuded moonscape, which quickly cooked into a cracked, baked plain. Turning the Nile into a breadbasket would require centuries of back-breaking labor to store water for the dry season, re-break and retill fields that would wash away in every flood season. Yet for the lower Nile's early inhabitants, all that work was worth it. The Nile provided two things nearly unique on Earth. The first was perfect agricultural inputs like reliable water and high-fertility soil. It wasn't scant desert rainfall that gave rise to the mighty Nile, but instead the seasonal torrents from the Ethiopian highlands and overflow from the African Great Lakes. The seasonal floods washed down soil of fertility far higher than what could be obtained outside the river valley. The Nile was flush with water supplies every year in a cycle so reliable that true droughts were quite literally biblical events. Perhaps more important was the second factor. The lower Nile was safe. One could stand on the ridges above the Nile floodplain at any point within 1,000 miles of the sea, look east or west, and be met with the exact same view: an endless desert waste. With the technology of transport largely limited to what you could carry yourself, it was simply impossible for any hostile force to cross the desert, which meant that it was nearly impossible for anyone, whether in the form of lions or barbarians, to reach the lower Nile. It was one of the few places in the world where there was enough water to survive and enough security to thrive. This combination of factors, high soil fertility, water supplies independent of and therefore more reliable than local rainfall, and physical security, not only provided food surpluses, but it also meant that even with a permanent guard there was still a surplus of labor. That surplus labor could be put to use in expanding irrigation networks and generating yet more food surpluses, building an army and taking over the neighboring city and its food production capacity, building walls, generating more security and freeing up yet more labor, or for general civilizational advancements in everything from metallurgy to writing. In short, this specific type of physical geography nearly guaranteed that the Egyptians would be on the road to civilization. Over the next 2 millennia, small tribal farming settlements consolidated into a series of city-states for mutual defense and to more efficiently apply labor to the problems of taming the Nile. The higher organization and greater labor specialization led to the copper breakthrough of 3600 BC. Copper sounds like a small thing, but once humans figured out how to smelt and cast it, they replaced their wood and stone implements with metal, generating staggering improvements in the productivity of each worker and each farmer. The resulting population boom generated more and larger cities with bigger and more complex political systems. Allied city-states merged into kingdoms that then struggled for supremacy. By 3150 BC, a single government dominated all of the useful Nile territories between the Mediterranean coast and what is today the city of Aswan. The era of the mighty Egyptian pharaohs had begun. The Nile was not the only terminal desert river valley to give birth to an ancient civilization. Lower Mesopotamia and the Indus River share similar geographies and spawned similar cultures for similar reasons. Yet the Nile was the only piece of the ancient world that advanced not just in terms of technical skills such as writing and road construction, but also in terms of political organization into larger and more complex governing structures. Egypt also proved to be the longest lasting of the ancient civilizations, outliving its ancient contemporaries by 2 millennia. What explains Egypt's success? Why did Egypt consolidate while its peers remained fractured? How did it so outlast the dozens of civilizations that evolved from it? It comes back to the first principle of the balance of transport. Moving stuff is hard. Egypt. The hard part is getting there. Externally, Egypt's buffer areas were far superior to those of Mesopotamia and the Indus. The Tigris is only rarely out of sight of the Zagros Mountains, while the Tigris and Euphrates both flow from Anatolia. It may be difficult to move things about in mountainous territory, but most mountains are sufficiently high to wring moisture out of the air. Where you have rain, you can have food, agriculture even. Both Anatolia and the Zagros have housed human populations as long as human history has been recorded. As for the Indus, its upper tributaries directly abut the Ganges Valley, allowing for regular contact with that far larger river valley. Local deserts insulated both Mesopotamia and the Indus from multiple directions, but not all directions. Their geographies were secure enough to spawn civilizations, but outside forces were still able to reach them, and so they never had the time to consolidate as Egypt did. In comparison, Egypt's borders are a class apart. To the west, it is 600 miles from the western edge of the Nile Delta to where rain falls regularly enough to support a non-nomadic population, contemporary Benghazi, Libya. 600 miles of dry, hot, empty is a long thing to raid across. Land attack from the east was more likely, but that's not to say it was probable. The Sinai Peninsula is just as inhospitable as the Bible suggests, and the 300 miles between the Delta and the Jordan River Valley have proven to be a formidable barrier right up to and even into contemporary times. A southerly approach seems better, and indeed following the Nile is certainly a less painful affair than trudging through desert. But as one moves upriver south, the Nile Valley narrows to a steep canyon in places, complete with the occasional rapids locally known as cataracts. And it is a long, winding 900-mile route before you reach a geography and a climate that can support a meaningful population, contemporary Khartoum, Sudan. Establishing multiple defensive positions along the route is quite easy. In other words, you really have to want to get to Egypt. Within Egypt, however, things are very different. Within Egypt, the Nile does two things. First and most obviously, it makes mass food production possible. Every patch of land within sight of the river is under cultivation, generating the most consistent food surpluses of any land throughout the history of not just the ancient world, but also the classical, medieval, and even early industrial worlds. This food surplus created the world's densest population footprint for most of human history, the only exception being contemporary Bangladesh. Combine that with the country's desert buffers, and any outside influence that was not an outright invasion would be so diluted in the sheer mass of the Egyptian population that the government would have little problem retaining control. Second, by ancient standards, the interior of Egypt was remarkably easy to get around in. From Aswan downriver, the valley is flat, in the dry season turning the river into a very slow-moving lake. The lack of elevation change results in a hazy, lazy downriver ride, while Egypt's prevailing north-to-south winds allow for fairly reliable upriver sailing. The Nile could support riverine traffic in a way that the Tigris, Euphrates, and Indus, cursed with faster currents, less reliable seasonal flows and winds, and omnipresent sandbars, never could. The key is the difference between the ease of internal versus external transport. Just as the difficulty of external transport inhibited invasion for centuries, allowing the Egyptians to wallow in splendid isolation, the ease of transport within so facilitated governance that Egypt was able to consolidate into a single kingdom more than 5,000 years ago.